evening, everybody. I'm Jerry Willis, and for the next hour, we will lay out for you what could be the biggest tax hike in our nation's history. With me to kick off this special Fox Business event, Steve Forbes, the chairman of Forbes Media, Grover Norquist, the president of Americans for Tax Reform, and a key member of the Congressional Joint Committee on Taxation, Republican Utah Senator Orrin Hatch. Welcome all. Senator Hatch, I'm going to start with you. I want you to listen to a comment that the president made today and respond to it for us. Here's what the president had to say.
We've said is that we should extend tax cuts, tax relief for middle-class Americans. What the Republicans are proposing is that we, in addition to that, provide tax relief to primarily millionaires and billionaires. It would cost us $700 billion to do it. On average, millionaires would get a check of $100,000. And by the way, I would be helped by this. So I just want to be clear. You know, I'm speaking against my own financial interests. It is a irresponsible thing for us to do.
Senator Hatch, is it irresponsible to continue these tax cuts for people in the 250,000 plus bracket?
It'd be irresponsible not to continue them because you don't raise taxes during a recession. Plus 50% of all of those taxes that will be paid by small businesses that are a major vehicle in hiring people. It would affect as many as 20 million workers. I get a kick out of some of the things that the president says because as though he's wealthy because of something he did before. He's wealthy because he ran for president. And in all honesty, he's not giving up anything. He's made a lot of money by being president and running for president. Now, so what? All I can say is that why would we raise taxes in the middle of a recession when he himself admitted that just last year?
Steve Forbes, to you now, the president just said that those tax cuts would cost $700 billion. Seems to me that that's something that we'll eventually have to pay back. We've got a huge debt, huge deficit. Is it worth it to pay for these tax cuts for the wealthy?
Well, that assumes, those numbers they bandy about assume that the government loses the revenue. What they overlook and have overlooked for 30 years since Ronald Reagan, or even going back further since John Kennedy back in the 1960s, is when you lower tax rates and increase incentive for risk-taking, productive work, success, you get more of those good things. So as we saw with Ronald Reagan and other tax cuts in the past, when you cut tax rates across the board, you have the government doing better because the economy does better. When you raise taxes on capital, you destroy capital, you hurt small businesses, you reduce incentives for people to take risks. It's all about incentive, and that's something these people just don't grasp.
Well, Grover, to you, there's a lot of conversation in the debate over taxes about what's fair and what's not fair. We've put together some graphics to help people get their arms around this idea of fairness, and we want to show them to you now. What is fair? Well, take a look at this. Do you realize that people earning under $32,000, that's 50% of the folks, they're responsible for paying just 3% of taxes? Now, let's take a look at people at the other end of the spectrum, people earning $160,000 and more. They represent just 5% of the population out there, and yet they're paying 60% of the national tax burden. Grover, what is the right way to think about fairness when it comes to talking about taxes?
Well, it's a difficult concept because taxation is taking money from people who earned it and giving it to people who are politically connected. So fairness isn't really necessarily part of the game. You want to have a tax structure that's less destructive. High marginal tax rates kill jobs, stop investment. One of the reasons why people aren't investing now, why businesses are sitting on over $1.8 trillion, is that they can see these higher tax rates coming in January. They're not waiting in January to kill jobs. They've already now not started new jobs, not done new investment. This threatened tax increase is hurting the economy already. It's not waiting for January.
Well, not waiting for January as well as Mitch McConnell. Senator Hatch, to you. Mitch McConnell came out with his plan for taxes. He wants to maintain all current income tax rates, prevent the marriage penalty from going away, continue the child tax credit. He wants to reform the death tax, the AMT. Does he have the right idea here, Senator?
Well, he sure does. As a matter of fact, let's face it, with this administration, you know, when this administration took over, the bottom 40% of wage earners did not pay any taxes, income taxes at all. Now that's up to 49%, and I think this administration is trying to push it to 60%, which would be a natural Democratic Party constituency. But look, we all know that to increase taxes right now would be a terrible thing. And look, the president has to realize there are at least 31 Democrats in the House who have already said we need to keep the tax cuts alive, the tax relief alive that President Bush put into play, and there are at least 5 or 6 in the Senate. So all they need to do is just follow what really ought to be done, and that is keep this tax relief going, and we'll have and get some certainty into the system, and you'll find that the small business and business in particular will expand, and more jobs will occur, and we'll keep more jobs here and more corporations in America rather than pushing them overseas.
Steve, you know, we were just showing pictures of Democrats who want to go the way of Republicans on the topic of income taxes. There are a myriad of plans out there, as the senator was just saying, for income taxes. Shouldn't part of any debate on what to do about income taxes take into consideration just how complicated the tax code is? Simplify it?
Yes, and I think someday soon, especially after 2012, Jerry, we're going to get a massive simplification of the tax code, perhaps even something basic like a flat tax, which I've advocated, and which 26 countries have adopted successfully around the world. So you could literally fill out your tax return on a single sheet of paper. That way you have enormous incentives. The government would end up collecting more because if you make it, you pay it. And that's the way to get the economy moving instead of trying to do this class warfare envy politics, which is based on bogus economics, that if you destroy capital, you somehow help the economy.
Well, and Grover, to you, we're going to talk about flat and VAT tax in just a second, but one of the things that people don't realize out there is that it's not just income taxes we're talking about when the Bush's tax plan expires. Tell us what middle class tax benefits are at stake here.
Well, there's tax credit, per child tax credit is out there, expansions of IRAs and 401ks. There are a whole series of reductions in taxes that were put in. The capital gains tax, which is very important to people. The dividend tax, which is important to retired people, jumps from 15 up to 40%. This is going to be a devastating body blow to the economy. And of course, Obama, Reid, and Pelosi are not just trying to stop lower taxes for some people. They're trying to stop lower taxes for all Americans. They're hoping to keep this conversation going so that for the next 3 weeks nothing happens. They can get past this election, and so they'll never have to extend the Bush tax cuts for anybody.
Wow, okay. Well, Steve Forbes, Grover Norquist, and Senator Hatch, please stand by. Coming up, you've heard our panel of experts on the problems each American faces if our tax cuts expire. Next, they are going to offer some solutions. Don't go away. We've got much more on the Willis Special Report, Tax to Death. Our current tax system has become the biggest political football of the campaign season. The mere mention of tax hikes could cost votes. But if Congress simply does nothing, we're staring at a monumental tax hike on all brackets across the board. So what are the alternatives? We continue now with Senator Orrin Hatch, Steve Forbes, and Grover Norquist. Steve Forbes, to you, you've been a longtime advocate of the flat tax. Why is that the best idea going?
Because it drastically simplifies the tax code so we don't spend 7.5 billion hours a year filling out tax forms. It lowers the tax rate down to 17%, has generous exemptions for adults and for children. Family of 4, no federal income tax on your first $46,000 of income, no tax on savings, no death tax. You should be allowed to leave the world, Jerry, unmolested by the IRS. Does the same thing on the business side, cuts it to 17, has a full write-off of capital expenditures, not just a one-year gimmick. And so that way, if you have a loss, you carry it forward against future profits. That way, Jerry, people can focus on doing real things instead of getting hung up on this increasingly complex, increasingly unfair, corruption-ridden tax code.
Senator Hatch, you know, people talk a lot about big ideas, flat tax, VAT tax, you name it, we've got all kinds of proposals on the table. But at the end of the day, what will Congress be willing to even entertain? I mean, are they in that kind of mood where they would rip away the income tax and replace it with something else?
Well, as you can see, the Democrats overwhelmingly control Congress, and they have every ability to be able to solve these problems before the end of the year. And if they don't, then we know exactly who to blame. You couldn't have two better people chatting with you about this than Steve Forbes and Grover Norquist. They're right in the middle of it all. And Steve has been advocating for a flat tax for years. It makes a lot of sense. And if you read his book, my gosh, you'll come to the conclusion that this man's really providing a mechanism and a way to maybe solve some of these problems. But, you know, the real problem is the Democrats who've had basically liberal control over the Congress my whole 34 years, when you count the 3 to 6 Republicans who usually go with them, they haven't been able to solve the problems in this country. It's about time we use some conservative solutions to these problems. And we all know that if you cut taxes and you give tax relief, people have incentives.
Senator, let me ask you this. You know,
Sure.
The House certainly could flip in November. Republicans are definitely going to have more control. Will they make major changes to the tax code?
Well, if we have enough people, they will. Now, I've been in the Senate 34 years. We never had a fiscal conservative majority because we've always had 3 to 6 more moderate to liberal Republicans who will go with the all-liberal Democrats. Now, I think we've got to get if we can get a total Republican conservative approach here, I think we could do a lot of things that would help this country come out of the mess it's in, make us competitive worldwide, reduce those corporate tax rates so that we are competitive, and I think we'd have not only jobs, but we'd have the revenues to be able to run this country the right way.
Grover, quickly, we don't have a lot of time left, but there's a lot of conversation now about instituting a debt ceiling. Obviously, when you're talking about income taxes and changing tax rates, you're also talking about the U.S. debt and the deficit. Do you think there should be a debt ceiling?
I think we need to focus on government spending rather than the deficit. The reason why the left likes to talk about the deficit is they want tax increases to be part of any quote-unquote solution. They've spent so much in the last 2 years that they're now turning around saying, why don't you Republicans be reasonable and help us raise taxes to pay for all the overspending we did? We need to focus on spending and bring that down, not take taxes up to meet the overspending.
All right. Well, thank you, Steve, Grover, Senator Hatch. Appreciate your time today.